Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody who's physically there in Budapest, as well as everybody who's online. So there have been a lot of really interesting sessions on different aspects of democracy, both its problems and innovations and ways forward over the past day. And this panel gives us an opportunity to take the long view. We have extremely distinguished historians who've written both about Hungary and indeed neighboring countries of Hungary and across Europe, and also about the United States, where democracy has had something of a drubbing in recent times as well. So we have a great opportunity to think about the 20th century leading into the 21st century, the historical antecedents and roots of many of the problems that we see today, but also potentially solutions from the past. It's going to be a discussion about the authoritarian playbook, which now has some quite depressingly familiar elements in it, as we see populists and particularly populist authoritarians or wannabe authoritarians using the same kinds of tactics and learning from one another. I must say I have wondered whether Joe Biden's democracy summit will be paralleled by a Trump-held summit in which he invites his favorite world leaders to discuss tactics such as voter suppression, ensuring that there are at critical moments there's a storming of the parliament, or indeed different ways of muzzling the media and sidelining civil society, because there's been so much parallel learning going on in many parts of the world in terms of undermining democracy and finding ways of capturing institutions and as well as rigging elections in entirely new and innovative ways. So our panel of historians has written about many of the warning signs that we need to look out for, from Tim Snyder's On Tyranny, as well as the amazing books that have come out recently from Anne Applebaum, from Timothy Garton and Charles Gati's perspectives as well. So warning signs such as the creation of an enemy. That's something to look out for, the takeover of the media and the key institutions of the state, and the normalizing of leaders telling medium-sized lies, as Anne Applebaum turns it, that has created fundamental confusion between truth and falsehood in the public mind. So there are some very practical tactics that they're sharing and learning from, but there are also some ways of changing the way people think about politics and even just think in general, which are not so very new. And I'm really struck by something that as an undergraduate, I was a huge fan, still am actually, of Hannah Arendt. And she wrote a very fundamental truth that is still very evident now in the age of social media, but she wrote it in an era long before that. She wrote, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the dedicated communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists." So we're going to talk about all of these different things and indeed more. I'm delighted to start with a round of questions to our panelists just to kick things off. And I've asked them to give short answers to very big questions. So we will come back to a number of these themes also later in the discussion, but it's just a chance to sort of air a few views and then to move into a more free-flowing discussion. So I'd like to invite, first of all, Professor Timothy Snyder from Yale University, well known for his writing about history, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, but also about the United States more recently. And how you've pointed in both of those contexts to how often authoritarian power grabs are based on racist claims of ethnic division from Nazi Germany to America today, in order to create divisions that rally the base of the would-be authoritarian and to create a scapegoat for the grievances of supporters. So why is it that racism so consistently is able to be exploited in this way, that it plays this role in the authoritarian playbook? Does it always have to, and also most critically, especially thinking about the United States today, does it always have to result in violence before the public mood turns? Or are there also suggestions, lessons from history, of ways of facilitating peaceful transitions back towards democracy and towards at least a modus vivendi in society, and maybe even social peace?
Okay, thank you, Heather. I like that we've reached the point that we're talking about transitions for the United States. I knew this day would come. I'm going to try to take a step back and make 3 or 4 larger analytical points and try to close with your question about violence. These may seem to be coming from a slightly different angle, but I think to understand the moment, we have to sometimes think in slightly unorthodox ways. I think one of the reasons why racism is increasingly resonant today has to do with technology. We spend more and more of our time in front of screens, and sometimes that's useful, but when we spend time in front of social media is itself categorizing us in terms of race. And it's putting us with people who social media believes are of the same race as we are. And if we show racist tendencies on social media categorizes us as racists and puts us with other racists. So in a number of other ways, the time we spend on social media tends to divide us racially. So despite expectations and intuitions, social media turns out not to be cosmopolitan or internationalist. It turns out to be de facto racist, not just polarizing, but de facto racist. And this leads not just to an intensification of beliefs, it also leads to action all around the world, but also in the United States. The people who took action on January 6th were not informed by the world around them, they were informed by what they saw on social media. A second larger and consistent source of the resonance of racial politics, in my view today, is the sense of catastrophe. There's a general sense, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, I think much around the world, that there is a coming catastrophe. There's just a difference in opinion about what that catastrophe is. For many people, the catastrophe is climate change, global warming, floods and fires. But for many other people, and they tend to be distinct groups, for many other people, the crisis is demography, not enough white people, not enough people like us. And for both groups, the crisis is going to hit around the year 2040. And I think this is no coincidence. I think the racial crisis, the demographic crisis, is a kind of alternative to the climate crisis. And what I worry about is that in this general sense of crisis, the idea that the real problem is the racial balance is going to start interacting with, or already has started interacting with, the objective climate problem. That is, as we start struggling for resources, as we face more and more natural catastrophes, the idea that the real problem is that people like us are becoming the majority will then inform the way that we react. And that we will react in political or military or violent terms, as you suggest, rather than reacting in terms of the science and what we should do to preserve the future. Which leads to the third thing that I want to point out about the resonance of the politics of race, which is that race allows for victim flipping. So to stay in the example of climate change, it's very easy to point to the refugees of climate change as being the aggressors. This happens all the time in Europe and the United States. Naturally climate change leads to south to north migration, with obviously some kind of, there'll be some kind of crisis, some kind of war, some kind of political crisis that draws our attention. But one of the ultimate causes from Syria to Guatemala is climate change. And so if we treat the refugees as the aggressors, then we forget what the ultimate cause is, right? And we can think of ourselves as the victims, which we see from Hungary to Kansas. The idea that refugees are the aggressors and we're the victims is a very comfortable idea. To switch examples back to yours, in Mr. Trump's claim that he won the election, and in the domestic terrorism attack of January 6th, you have the same kind of victim flipping, which is allowed by race. It's somehow not that a billionaire president, who's basically been able to do everything he wanted his whole life, lost an election. Instead, it's somehow that Black people stole it from him, right? It's as simple as that. And so somehow the problem is that somehow the problem is supposed to be that some white people's votes weren't counted, when in fact we have 2 centuries of Black people either not voting at all or having a very difficult time in general voting. So you have a kind of almost perfect 180-degree victim flipping, which is where I want to land. The politics of race allows you to change the way that time works, because if someone's of a different race or if they're an outsider like a migrant, that means that they're always going to be on the outside, and politics can always be about us and them. And when politics is about us and them, it's very comfortable for people who have come to power, usually with some kind of oligarchical backing, because the last thing they want to do is deal with the future. The last thing they want to do is make policy. It's much more comfortable to have a present enemy, whether it's migrants or Soros in Hungary, or whether it's Blacks and migrants from the South in the United States. It's much easier to have a permanent enemy and keep time in the present because that allows you not to have to govern, not to have to actually face anything. And so that's why racism, even if whether or not you're by conviction you're a racist, is a comfortable way to govern at the present moment. Thanks.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to think about there, and many case studies come to mind, actually, of how this is done and the different ways that this plays out. And your point about time especially is really key, because we'll come on to talk a bit later about the uses and abuses of the past in the politics of, in anti-democratic politics. But the point about the future, avoiding discussing the future, and also that, of course, relates to your point about climate too. If you're busy fighting an enemy of the present, you don't have to think about climate change and come up with any kind of policies to combat it. So now we'll move on to Anne Applebaum, journalist, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, currently at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, well known to the audience for her books and for her expertise on Central Europe. So, Anne, what I'd really like to kind of draw on is your work in thinking about, as a particularly good quotation in your most recent book, given the right conditions, any society can turn against democracy. And you've even written, all of our societies eventually will. So if we think about the many cases where societies have turned against democracy and where we see warning signs already, what are the regional nuances you see? There are clearly some conditions that hold across geographies, but given how well you know Poland in particular, it would be really interesting to think about whether the conditions were always there for a one-party takeover, or were they created by a particular party? Are those conditions always there ripe for exploitation? And it's just a matter of time until somebody takes them up, and if in the right circumstances, there will always be a populist who arises to take up the opportunity from, of course, Germany in the 30s to America today. Is it a matter of conditions and the kind of breeding ground, or is it also about the kinds of actors who take them up? Thanks.
So thank you, Heather. Greetings to the audience in Budapest. I'm actually in Los Angeles in a hotel room where it's very early in the morning. Sorry, I'm not there to be drinking coffee with you. Let me answer your question in a broader way, because actually I do believe that that's correct. That the turn against democracy can happen anywhere. There are no exceptional nations. When the founding fathers wrote the American Constitution, they were highly aware of how democracy had failed in ancient times. They were literally reading Greek and Roman histories while they wrote it. They were referring to it in their conversations. Some Roman statesmen and from the Republican era, particularly Cato, were actually almost folk heroes at the time of the Revolution, and there were plays and songs about them that people read and knew. They were part of popular culture. So the idea that there could be a republic and that it could fail, and that one of the sources of failure would be a demagogue who would divide people, was very commonly known. In the last decade or two, well, really in the last 50 or 60 years, we, particularly in the US, but also in Western Europe, I think forgot this because we were living in an era of such incredible success and prosperity. And because liberal democracy seemed undefeatable, and therefore, as Tim Snyder has written, inevitable. There was nothing special that we had to do in order to keep it going, because it would just automatically be there. And none of us had to worry about it that much because there were some professional politicians who would somehow keep it going, and we didn't have to make very much effort. And then it turned out that, in fact, democracy can be undermined anywhere. And in fact, I think the question to ask is not so much particularly about Poland, although I'm happy to return to it. But the question is why this is happening in so many different societies all at the same time. So one of my probably most important insights over the last several years was that Polish politics and American politics are not that different. And this is bizarre if you think about it, because Poland has nothing to do with America politically, geographically, demographically. I mean, it's a homogenous society with no history of, with virtually no racial minorities. So how did Poland manage to create two tribes that hate each other almost as much as Americans do? And how did you get this similar kind of language? And the conclusion that I came to is that we're living in a moment that makes this, that's more conducive to this kind of politics. And I'll just list a few of the possible explanations, and then maybe we can return to the specifics of Poland later. One of them, as Tim said, is social media, the nature of modern communication. And I'll emphasize a different piece of it, namely that the business model of most modern media, and by the way, that includes cable television and quite a lot of websites, as well as social media per se. The business model is the sale of emotion and anger. In order to get people to click on things, it turns out that if you make them angry, if you offer them the prospect of division, that makes your post or your story move faster. It creates a higher reaction. It keeps people online further. This is something that Facebook, for example, has studied, knows very well, and has understood from the very beginning of when the product was invented, that what it needs to do is make people angry, make people emotional, keep them on the site. That's how you sell advertising. I mean, these are mostly vehicles for selling advertising. And that has had an impact on the politics of America, Poland, the Philippines, Turkey, Hungary, Britain and France. And that's one, and that's now, because that's now the fundamental underlying, theme of so much of what people are doing when they turn on their phones or their laptops looking for information, is they're looking for that kind of stimulation because they are used to getting it there. And that's made politics different. So the rules of politics that were once set by town halls or by television studios or by parliaments, the rules of conversation are now thrown out the window. There used to be time for each side. There used to be a benefit for rational debate. There were, people got points for making logical arguments. That's gone in our era, and people get points for quite different reasons. The second reason I would give is there's a very similar kind of loss of agency that people feel all around the world, which is related to globalization, although it's not exactly the same thing. I mean, the feeling that my government doesn't control what happens in my country. So a person in China can make a decision and my factory will be closed, or a person in Brussels will make a decision and the project I wanted to do doesn't work. And they're not wrong about this. In a world where so many problems are global and international and they have to be solved in different ways, national and regional and local governments, the kind of people you're used to voting for or touching, are less influential than they used to be. And smaller countries sometimes feel this more profoundly than others. And so this loss of agency, the sense that, I vote for these people and then they can't do anything about it. It's something that's real, and it was one of the elements of globalization that was mostly unacknowledged for a long time. And finding ways to communicate with voters given that loss of agency is one of the things that Democrats now have to do and begin to think about. The third thing I would say, and this is, and I'll just be very brief, is the loss of U.S. leadership at a moment when, when there's a sense of rising other powers. And so, although the rise of China or Russia doesn't necessarily affect any of us personally, I mean, here I am sitting in Los Angeles and I don't see China anywhere around me. But the feeling that there are alternative systems, they have an alternative set of values, they have the money and the power to influence, for example, Hollywood directors and how they make their movies, has given people the sense that the certainty in democracy and the certainty that our system, that our civic religion, that our faith in our system has been undermined. And again, I think this also hasn't been sufficiently acknowledged, that China offers an alternative model. It's an ugly model in many ways. Not everybody, loves it or worships it or admires it. But it offers particularly developing nations a different path to wealth. And then, as I said, the influence that Russian, Chinese, and other wealthy autocrats have on our politics, all of us feel it. And then finally, I would just make one comment about demography as well. I think it's Ivan Krastev has written very brilliantly about the phenomenon of emigration being just as important as the phenomenon of immigration. So the feeling that people have, and this is true in rural America, it's true in rural Poland, it's true in many small towns, that young people are leaving, that the clever, and the talented go to the cities, and that we have a sense of loss. Our civilization is somehow disappearing. The traditions that we grew up with are no longer observed by younger people. This also is not wrong. It's a true, there are ways of life that are changing. I mean, of course and again, democratic and liberal leaders need to acknowledge that sense of loss too, that that's a real feeling, and find ways to compensate people or help them adjust to it. And so I would just finish by saying, it's my hope that liberals of the present, who want to rule in the future, understand the roots of some of this discontent, and look carefully at the ways to address it, and not try to deny it or paper it over or say it's not true. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very fantastic insights also into the dark side of interdependence. That there are many parts of, globalization has also created, has given momentum to a number of the factors you point to. So in the interest of time, I'll turn now to Charles Gati, Senior Research Professor of European and Eurasian Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Great expert, of course, on Central and Eastern Europe, as well as Russian politics and foreign policy, and served, of course, in the State Department in policy planning as well. So Charles, you're in much of your work on Moscow, Washington, Budapest, and indeed your most recent book on Zbigniew Brzezinski, you point to the way in which there is such a long legacy of nationalist and nativist authoritarianism. I'm curious to see how you see it evolving between the 20th and the 21st centuries. How are the roots in the past driving events that are happening today?
Thank you very much, indeed, Heather. And let me start out by saying, or by stating, the main conclusion that I have to your question, and it is that in the past 100 years, Hungary was led for the longest time by three authoritarian or semi-authoritarian leaders who enjoyed widespread popular support. Let me elaborate on this. First, between the First World War and the Second World War, Hungary was run by Horthy, who after a few years of terror consolidated his authority by a nationalist course. The slogan of the era was "No, no, never," or in Hungarian, "Nem, nem, soha," meaning that Hungary would not accept the settlements after World War I, which produced a Hungary 2/3 smaller than it used to be. So as a result, this nationalist regime, which I call goulash fascism, acquired almost universal support in the countryside, and to a lesser extent in the cities themselves. Now, secondly, from 56 to 88, Hungary was run by János Kádár, who also, like Horthy, started out with years of terror. But later on, he had a nationalist wink, you might call it, to distinguish Hungary from the rest of the Soviet bloc. He had economic reforms. He was supposedly reluctant to intervene in Czechoslovakia in 1968. He reached out to the IMF. So this was goulash communism, called at least that way in the West. But the important thing to remember is that many Hungarians believe that Kádár, that they were superior to and better off than others in the communist camp. And therefore, he too enjoyed considerable popularity. When he died, there were tens of thousands of people lined up. And even today, there is an element of nostalgia for those decades. Now, thirdly, at least in 2010, Viktor Orban has also had considerable appeal to his countrymen because his policies rest on nationalist policies and rhetoric. He presents himself as a brave patriot standing up to outside powers that in his story try to dominate the country. He's defending Hungarian sovereignty against the European Union, of which Hungary is, of course, a member, and against American liberals. He has even gone so far as to parallel his stance in 1989 against Moscow with the current brawl that he has had with Brussels. And yet, he is widely seen as a protector of Hungarian independence, particularly in the countryside, where his semi-authoritarian course trumps the attraction of liberal democracy. So what can we make of this history? I want to stress that popular attraction to Horthy, Kádár, and now to Orban should not be dismissed, certainly not lightly dismissed. It's a mistake to claim that only leaders are bad and the people are good. That's nonsense. At the same time, nationalism is not necessarily, certainly not Orban's nationalism, is not the wave of Hungary's future. There are countervailing forces in evidence, which I obviously don't have time to unpack, but just briefly in 1 minute, I'd like to identify them. First, on the domestic scene, there is now a coalition of strange bedfellows composed of 5 political parties has emerged to oppose the current regime. It resembles the Israeli coalition in its diversity, at least, but it may win next spring's parliamentary elections, obviously only if the elections are not only free, which I believe they will be, but fair as well, which I don't believe that it will be. So this coalition will almost certainly carry most large cities. Already, most of you have been to Budapest. I have not been there now for a couple of years, but there are some people there half jokingly, using Budapest wit, say that what's really wrong with liberal Budapest is that it is surrounded by provincial Hungary. Abroad, too, there are several favorable tendencies. The country's borders are open. Hungary is a member of both the European Union and NATO, and its foreign trade is very heavily dependent on Europe, especially on Germany. So, in a concluding sentence, I will say that the future does not exclude the rise of pluralist democracy. As elsewhere in the transatlantic world, the future largely depends on what or who prevails: cities with their Western-oriented majorities, or the countryside, which is still enthralled by Hungary's nationalist past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. We will return to a number of these issues, and I think the audience will have some thoughts and questions on this too.
Well, I suppose that I insulted enough people in Budapest who are not at the conference.
We relied on you for that. So we'll turn now to Timothy Garton Ash, of course, a professor of European Studies at Oxford, and of course also at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, a very distinguished historian indeed, and who now has the unusual distinction of being the subject of an official public lecture from a sitting prime minister. Now, I think all of you have received state medals from one country or another in the course of your careers, but I think Timothy is the only one who's actually received a personally written lecture from a prime minister, in which he objected to what Timothy said in an interview he gave with Euronews, and he argued under the title Samizdat number 12 that there is a Central European cultural, intellectual, and political entity that is growing more and more different from Western Europe, but this is not hazardous. It is not a threat. It is, in fact, a blessing for the European Union and even Western Europe. And he, as this is not new, I mean, this has been going on for a number of years, that he claims to speak for the whole of Central Europe and claims that the European Union should respect cultural diversity and that there is a division of views in Europe between Western Europe and Central Europe. And these are simply different ways of approaching democracy and indeed a whole load of other issues from human rights to very specifically minority rights and so on. And of course, he draws, and this is a very interesting part of his rhetoric, on history to support his arguments. So there's both misuse and abuse of history, which would be of the past, which would be interesting to think about, but also this argument that somehow intellectual debate in Europe is divided into two zones. This is, of course, sounds very neat, but also the idea that views on democracy are simply a matter of opinion and of cultural diversity. How would you respond to this?
Well, thank you, Heather. And first of all, I'm very sorry I can't be with you all in Budapest, sitting in a cafe with this wonderful panel. I think one can actually draw several lessons from the past out of this very peculiar message that Viktor Orban has delivered at my address. First of all, it's one of a series of messages which he calls samizdat. Samizdat number 12. Now, as you all know, samizdat was self-publishing by dissidents in the Soviet Union and Central and Eastern Europe who could not reach the public by any other means. All other means were banned to them. Here we have a prime minister who has instant access to an entire national media, and more than that, has actually suffocated many of the independent and critical media in Hungary, such that it's actually, were it not for the internet, his critics who might have need of samizdat. So lesson number one, beware the false analogy, deliberately false analogy. Lesson number two, beware the tactic of ideological distraction. So my criticism in an interview on Euronews to which he responded was entirely about the erosion of liberal democracy in Hungary. His response is entirely about conservatism versus liberalism. It's about Hungary, and he says Central Europe, standing up for conservative, Christian, traditional, ethno-nationalist values against the decadent West, dismantled by neo-Marxism, he says, in the United States, and the idea of the open society, and by, I quote, the flood of Muslims in Europe. Well, we can talk about that, but it is entirely irrelevant to the criticism that I was making, which is not at all about conservatism versus liberalism. You can perfectly well have a strongly conservative nationalist government in a country that remains a liberal democracy. I have the misfortune to be speaking to you from one such country, Brexit Britain. But it's a completely different issue. So point number two, beware the ideological distraction. Point number three, and here I think there is actually something to be said for the historical case he makes, actually quite powerfully argued, rhetorically powerfully argued, it has to be said. He was not a bad student. Basically what he's saying is, you keep talking about European values, but we too represent a set of European values. We represent a different set of European values, another Europe, conservative, Christian, traditional, national, and so on. That is true, empirically true. Conservatives, reactionaries, fascists talked a great deal about Europe. The Nazis talked a great deal about Europe. Not, of course, that I'm saying Orban is a fascist. Oswald Mosley, the British fascist, and his wife published a magazine called The European in the 1950s. There's a whole large tradition of reactionary and indeed fascist thinking about and speaking in the name of Europe. So that we have to watch out when we just easily talk about European values. The real point here is to be specific. It's European Union values. the European Union values are a subset of this much broader spectrum of European values. And that's what we have to address and need to defend. So I think that's an interesting point. That takes me to the fourth one, which is, and here I think slightly disagree with Charles Gati, why has the European Union been so spectacularly unsuccessful in preventing the systematic erosion of democracy in Hungary over the last decade? You know, the subject of the whole conference is sustainable democracies, but arguably the EU has been sustaining the erosion of democracy in Hungary and to some extent in Poland. And I hope we can talk about that, but just a couple of quick thoughts. The first is historical. It's what, in the jargon of social science, is path dependency. There was a discussion about admitting fascist Spain under Franco to the European Economic Community in the early 1960s. And quite a lot of people said, why not? It's an economic community. And only the argument for saying, no, you need to be a democracy, only narrowly won the day. Subsequently, with successive enlargements, Spain, Portugal, Greece, particularly Central and Eastern Europe, the Copenhagen criteria, democracy has been embedded as a core value of the European Union, Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union, but it's actually been retrofitted onto what is still basically an economic community. And the great failure has been to establish any real operational linkage between the Europe of values which we proclaim and the Europe of money which Viktor Orban and Fidesz, and indeed PiS and Kaczynski in Poland, are still getting in its billions. Last point, lesson from the past. In this respect, I have to say, it is quite simply the lesson about the dangers of appeasement. Please remember that in the 1930s, appeasement was regarded as something very positive. It was the attempt to moderate and keep the peace by engaging with and appeasing fascist leaders. Now, again, I'm not going to say that Viktor Orban is a fascist, that we can talk about, but in the structure of the engagement, the European Union has been making precisely the mistake of appeasement, constantly relying on engagement, on negotiation, on talking, keeping Fidesz inside the European People's Party, and it's had as bad results as appeasement usually had. So I think there's some really quite interesting lessons from the past that can be taken off that very curious soi-disant samizdat message.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn briefly back to Tim Snyder, because I know he has to go. Just for any reflections you might have on this last question that Timothy raised regarding why is it that the EU and indeed NATO and every other international institution has been so poor at tackling the erosion of democracy? Once a member, always a member, it seems to be. Is it the retrofitting and the points Timothy Garton-Ash made? Is it also, frankly, just prime ministers don't like to kick out other prime ministers because they think, well, but for the grace of God, there go I. This might apply to me at some point. You're on mute. You're on mute.
I think that's certainly true. Your last practical point, but I want to suggest a couple of more abstract explanations. Number one, and Tim Garton-Ash has already suggested this, is that this business of inevitability applies not just to Americans after 1989, but it also applies to the premises of the European Union, not as it was created, but as it self-understands since the 1990s, namely that if we get the economic piece and the institutional piece right, then the political piece will naturally follow. So the American notion of inevitability is much closer to just pure economics leads to politics. The European one also involves membership and institutions, but there's the same, roughly speaking, style of thought. If we get one piece right, the other piece will necessarily follow. And I think that rests fundamentally on a basic self-deception about what the European Union is. The European Union has a story about how it's a result of learning from the Second World War. And I think that's incorrect. I think what the European Union really is a kind of rescue vessel after empire, whether it's your own, whether it's the German Empire failing in 1945, whether it's maritime empires failing in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, for example, Spain, or whether it is the former outer empire of the Soviet Union. Europe has never shown that Europe can sustain democratic nation states. That's never actually happened. There have been empires with democratic cores, but there's never been a bunch of durable democratic nation states in Europe. That's simply never happened. With the help of integration, the post-imperial fragments, the post-imperial centers have been able to cobble together a system which generally supports democracy. But what it lacks, I think, is the self-awareness that this is what it's all about, that when empires break down, you need this larger project to sustain democracy. And this supports Tim's point, because you can, if you're not aware that this is the purpose of it, to take post-imperial bits and to help to be democratic nation states, of course you're going to appease. If you don't have a historical self-awareness of where this is meant to go, of course you're going to appease, because what else are you going to do? Which leads me to the slightly larger point I wanted to make, which about all of this, which is about norms. So I think we're in this funny situation where on the right, we have normative language without norms. And on the left, we have norms without normative language. So the left has conceded the discursive ground of right and wrong to the right. But meanwhile, in Hungary or in America under Trump or in lots of other places under Putin, you have normative language all the time, which is utterly empty of actual norms, right? So like the way Orban cites Christianity, for example, is utterly without any Christian norms, as Donald Tusk pointed out to him once. But nevertheless, it's normative language. So I think one of the things that if liberal democracies are going to sustain themselves, the people who support them are going to have to return to some kind of normative language, which is consistent with norms. We can no longer rely upon history or technology or economics to automatically bring us to where we want to be. That has all failed. It's going to require a certain amount of perhaps apparently naive commitment to principle and the ability to articulate principle and to say that one system is better than another system. Because after all, returning to some of your other points, when it says that China and Russia present alternative models, that's true in a way, but they don't present alternative models the way that fascists and communists used to present alternative models. Fascist and communist alternative models were utterly clear. The Chinese and the Russians, however, mostly present our model as having failed. They mostly present our model as hypocritical. They present our model as doomed. And you can't respond to that by criticizing their model so much, because their model isn't actually a fixed target. It's not really there the way that fascism and communism were there. I think you can only respond to it by reasserting or doubling down on your own normative positions about your system, rather than seeing it as an inevitability, rather than seeing it as something that has to be. You have to actually make claims for it. And the right and the left have to find a way of repartitioning this, because right now, some people are using normative language without norms, and other people are trying to talk about norms, but are afraid to use the language. So that's my thought.
Thank you very much. And we understand you need to leave us.
I'm afraid I have to bow out. Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure to be with all of you. And as Tim says, I wish I could do this in Budapest. All the best.
We'll manage another time. Thank you and bye. So, Anne, I'd really like to come to you on this question as well, particularly because Tim also made reference to a number of things that you said there. And in particular, this question about empire and the vestiges of empire, because of course, Poland too had an empire at some point. And it's interesting how politicians draw on sometimes this language of, you know, the greater, whatever it is. Global Britain, I think, is the terminology in the UK now, but you know, Greater Poland, certainly Hungary, pre-Trianon Hungary is used all the time, and we see this in a lot of countries. I mean, France also, I think, is a very interesting example of a country that found its place in the world through the by essentially being in charge of the European Union along with Germany, as a new way of becoming larger than just territorial France with the loss of a lot of its empire. Britain, of course, famously that didn't work. And nostalgia for empire, it was one of the key elements in the Brexit campaign for older voters in particular. So I think this is an interesting notion. And I don't know, I mean, having lived and worked in Brussels for the past 16 years, I'm struck by how ahistorical many people working in and around the European Union are. It's, of course, a selective reading of history, as happens in most epistemic communities. But in particular, this issue of empire, especially with now the decolonization debate, it's something nobody wants to touch, nobody wants to talk about. I think that this is linked to democracy because it means that there are aspects of national politics which it's impolite to discuss. It's very impolite to talk about another country's nationalist politics, especially if it's about nostalgia of empire. And I wonder if that's part of the problem, that it's okay to discuss certain issues within countries, but not between them. And as a result, that then leads to a general kind of squeamishness about talking about democratic erosion in other countries. And that's why so few political leaders are prepared to do it across countries. Just curious about your views on this question of empire.
Yes, thank you. I mean, you asked a lot of things together there at once. You were right that nostalgia and nostalgia for some kind of imagined past is very much with us now. And in a way, it's the opposite of what, you know, you mentioned at the beginning you'd like this panel to do a little bit, which is to look for useful lessons from history. You know, there are different ways of looking back at the past, and one of them is to, you know, one of them is a kind of innocent nostalgia where, you know, people who like old churches and frayed photo albums and find it interesting to think about the past. I mean, you might even put me in that category. I like old churches and frayed photo albums. And then there are people who make use of the past in order to criticize the present, to say, we aren't what we used to be. This isn't good. You know, this isn't, you know, we've fallen, we've failed. There's another era that we can look to for, you know, for inspiration, and we're looking to that era not as a whimsical, you know, amusing, you know, look back in history, but we actually want to bring it back. And actually, the first political leader in the West who did this as a, you know, in a public and aggressive way was actually Putin, who brought back the annual May celebration of the end of the war, which is absolutely an imperial celebration. You know, they have people, you know, they have soldiers dress up in Soviet uniforms. They have, you know, old Soviet flags on Red Square, and they reenact the moment of the greatest Soviet imperial expansion, which was May 1945. And revel in that moment once again. And Putin has implied through his statements and his foreign policy that this isn't just a kind of, you know, sepia tinged look at the past. This is actually what he wants to bring back. He wants to put Russia at the center of the European story again. And the question is whether, you know, all of your, you know, as you say, most European countries either participated in an empire or, you know, had some other, had some other role in the past, were larger, had different borders. The question is whether, instead of doing that, instead of kind of reifying the past and making it into a symbol of, you know, critical of the present, whether we can find useful lessons from that era. Whether, you know, one of my great regrets about Russia, for example, is that by, you know, celebrating 1945, and kind of downplaying the Soviet era more generally. The Russians just don't, I mean, it's not that the Gulag is a forbidden subject, it's just not really talked about. It's just not part of the public debate. The Russians lose a lot of heroes. So all of the, you know, the modern human rights movement was founded in Russia. Many of the people who first began using the techniques of human rights, you know, speaking, you know, appealing to international organizations, using them as a way to criticize their system and so on, they were all Russians. And by ignoring and, you know, those people, modern Russians lose a whole pantheon of heroes, ranging from the great Gulag memoirists, you know, Yevgeny Ginsburg and so on, and going all the way up through Sakharov, who's simply not present much in modern Russian culture. And so what would be useful for modern European countries also would be to look at their imperial pasts and find what's good in them, find whether it's the anti-slavery forces in Britain, which were so influential around the world, whether it's the whether the French idea that anybody can be French, which is a very attractive form of citizenship, so whether we can look at the past and find constructive things to do with it, rather than saying it didn't happen or pretending it didn't exist or just being embarrassed about it. And it would be really, a useful thing to do, as you say, particularly in modern Brussels, where everything happens in the present, to talk more about the past, what we learned from it, what we experienced, what kind of nations we really used to be. And that would make for a better and more open conversation. And I'm very, this is just a tiny anecdote. My children went to British schools and never learned about the British Empire. And I think that's a shame. I mean, that was why I sent them to British schools, because I wanted them to learn about the British Empire. And the failure to talk about or remember or study, what happened has created this, as you say, this kind of sheen of embarrassment. So the only way to talk about the British Empire is as if it, in some, I mean, I don't want to go off into celebrating the British Empire, but finding lessons, understanding how people actually lived, focusing on the real past, and remembering what was both good and bad about it would be incredibly useful for all Europeans, and maybe even particularly for Europeans in Brussels who do sometimes seem like they want to pretend the past doesn't exist.
That was an absolutely terrific set of arguments for why history is essential for democracy. That if you can't talk about the past in frank and also critical terms, critical in the sense of critical thinking terms, it's actually very hard to have a democratic debate about a whole range of issues in the present. And I think there are a lot of fantastic examples of that. So, Timothy, can I come back to you about that particular issue, especially living in Britain as you are, and having seen so much of this? And then I'll come to you, Charles. So go ahead, Timothy.
Yeah, Heather, I actually want to take that forward because it's a very interesting thought and talk about the EU as empire, because you in Brussels are living in the capital of an empire which denies that it is an empire. It's an empire which gathers the remnants of so many former empires, as Tim Snyder rightly said. It's an empire which denies that it's an empire like the United States, but it is an empire, not a colonial overseas empire, but an empire in the sense of the First German Reich, what we know in English as the Holy Roman Empire, was an empire. And I actually think it would be very useful. And by the way, also the capital, the former capital of one of the worst European empires, the Belgian Congo. The Residence Palace, where we often meet in the center of the European Quarter in Brussels, was built as a residence for colonial administrators coming back from the Belgian Congo. But nobody in Brussels either talks about that or makes anything of it. So actually, it's awkward to disagree with someone who's left the room, but I do not agree with Tim Snyder that we have too little normative language. I think the EU almost has too much normative language. The trouble is it doesn't deliver on that normative language. And in order to deliver on that normative language, you have to understand that you are in some sense an empire and that certain obligations follow for parts of that empire, let's put it that way, from being part of that empire. So I think there's a really interesting complex of issues around the denial, the complex, the multiple denial of empire. Can I add one other point, Heather, which is about cultural determinism, the fallacy of cultural determinism. And this connects to the very interesting thing Anne said when she said she came to the conclusion that Polish politics and American politics aren't that different. So when I criticize the erosion of democracy in Hungary and Poland, and say a French MP or a Spanish journalist or a Belgian academic criticize the erosion of Hungary and Poland and Hungary, at first glance, it sounds as if we're saying exactly the same thing. Actually, we're saying something completely different. I am saying these are European countries which set out on the path to democratize, liberalize, and Europeanize, and now have been wrenched away from that path by their current governments with the support of a lot of their people. I mean, Charles is absolutely right. He or she is saying these were never really proper European countries anyway. They never really had the European Enlightenment. It's the old West European prejudices about Eastern Europe that go all the way back to the Enlightenment. Larry Wolff's wonderful book, The Invention of Eastern Europe, describes this perfectly, what I call intra-European Orientalism. And the conclusion they draw, quite different from mine, is that they're never going to make it. They're never going to be proper democratic Enlightenment European countries. And therefore, it was a great mistake to take them in. And really, it'd be much better if we could kick them out. And I heard a senior Spanish official in the European Commission just the other day saying precisely that to me. I don't know why we took them in. It'd be much better if we get them out. So that is the fallacy of cultural determinism. That to believe because they were authoritarian regimes in the past, it necessarily follows that they can't be proper democracies now. One hardly needs to point out that Spain was an authoritarian regime for much of the 20th century. Portugal was an authoritarian regime for much of the 20th century. Germany had quite a bit of it too. You know, the liberal gamble is that politics can actually change culture. But I think that's a really important aspect, particularly in the European debate about Central and Eastern Europe, because these old prejudices that Larry Wolff described, the intra-European Orientalism, is back in spades.
Sadly, it's quite hard to disagree with that view living in Brussels and having worked on enlargement policy so much in the past. The thing is that also in the European Union, certainly at the level of leaders and diplomats and civil servants and so on, there's a kind of politeness around difficulties in other countries, which means that people don't debate these things openly. So it's also quite hard to counter those kinds of views. And it's striking also how what are often simply temporary trends are seen as permanent. I remember talking to the former president of the Commission, José Manuel Barroso, about why is it there's never been a far-right party in Portugal? Why is there actually so little racism and anti-migrant sentiment in Portugal? Now, of course, there is, it's just arrived, but this was just before that. And he said, well, you know, because if you think about the Portuguese culture and history and tradition, we just have no cultural background for this, so it couldn't possibly arise, and of course it has now. So I mean this goes back to Anne's point about, you know, given the right conditions, there are plenty of things that can arise in many countries. So Charles, I'd like to come back to you now and get your views on all of this, particularly given how much the legacy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire has played in and still plays every day in Hungarian politics, how you see this issue of empire. And is it, especially given that different resonance in Hungary, this claiming, as you pointed out earlier, that somehow the stance against Brussels is the same as the stance against Moscow used to be, and in some countries you hear it's the same as it used to be the stance against Istanbul. Are there ways of weaving this into an open democratic debate that could learn some lessons from history? You're on mute now, so you just need to press the button. There we go.
Okay, can you hear me now? I beg your pardon. Yeah, difficult questions. Let me say this: I'm also very critical of the European Union and its appeasement policies. I regret deeply that NATO does not have an opportunity to kick out members. I played a role. You were good enough to mention the policy planning staff for NATO enlargement. I don't regret that, but I do regret not thinking at those great moments of expectations and hope that some members may not live up to the letter and spirit of NATO and then subsequently of the European Union. That was a huge mistake, and I think primarily by the Americans. So I do agree actually with Tim Ash that they should be different organizations, and certainly the EU has had the means, but they are, as everybody knows, they don't want to punish because they're afraid that the next time around they would be punished. And so therefore they are all but impotent except for verbal criticisms. There is a paradox here. The paradox is that even under these circumstances, for Hungary to be, or Poland to be in the European Union is good for Hungary and Poland. And in both countries, there is significant public support for the European Union, whatever the leaders say. The problem is, as I think that's what Tim was hinting at or was saying, the problem is that their reluctance to subscribe to European values is bad for the EU. So on the one hand, what's happening is that the European Union does not live up to its values. On the other hand, the fact that Poland and Hungary are still in the EU is pretty good for them. So how do you resolve this kind of paradox? Another way of saying is that Hungary would be worse, even worse off than it is without the European Union and without NATO, where actually the cooperation is not all that bad. So the problem is, Heather, as you said it so well, that once a member, always a member, and without radically changing the charters of the EU and NATO, which I don't expect. I would hope for, but I don't expect. These are remain politically ineffective organizations, which is why I may stun some people on this panel or in the audience. I am completely opposed to further enlargements unless there is a revision of the charters of both of these organizations.
I think there's also a question about reviewing whether or not current members, not only those who joined in 2004 and 2007, but also those who joined earlier, actually meet the Copenhagen conditions. And interestingly enough, actually the EU is trying to retrofit that. That's what these rule of law scoreboards, the latest ones about to come out, are about. And I think this question about linking the democratic conditions with money is important. What Timothy Garton Ash referred to earlier as being the Europe of values is disconnected from the Europe of money. Well, actually, the Commission has finally taken action on this and is using money as a lever. But this is an interesting question too, because historically in Europe, we haven't really had such a close connection between democracy and money, because both democracy and indeed finances, public finances, were kept within the borders of the nation state. And the interesting thing about the European Union now, with its big, elements of fiscal federalism, with this enormous recovery and resilience packages, which have given an unprecedented amount of money to national governments from central funds. This is the only parallel we've had. This is in fact empire, because empires have to have forms of fiscal federalism. But of course, this is not democratically decided. And I'm just interested in your thoughts about this relationship between democracy and money, because, well, there's other things we could go into, like the relationship between corruption and authoritarianism, and all three of you have actually written about that in various ways. But is this question about taxpayers' money being spent in other countries, which is the EU, what the EU is doing, and now trying to put retrospectively a lot more conditions on that, but also this idea of common responsibility that would require one country bailing out another, which has been the enormous debate in the European Union over the past 12 years. How does this play as well? I'm curious to what you think about this historically too, that there are these interdependencies which extend across Europe in at a much deeper level than we see globally, because of the way that the economies are interdependent, but also because increasingly public finances are intertwined. Who would like to take that one up? Anne, please go ahead.
I can just say a few words on it. I think this is a really important turning point because for the first time, it's as if the Commission is taking responsibility for taxpayers' money as taxpayers' money. In other words, it's not just some money that appeared somewhere and we have the right to dispose it, but they're treating it in a political way. You know, do Swedish or German or Spanish taxpayers want to fund programs, I don't know, whatever, road construction programs in Hungary and Poland, if the funds for those construction programs are going to be stolen or misused and are going to support autocratic regimes. I mean, finally, the Commission is thinking in that way and in a way reflecting accurately the feelings of taxpayers. And this, I think, although there's going to be a rough patch, as we have it already in Poland, a kind of reaction against the Commission and a new level of anti-EU propaganda that we haven't seen before in Poland, where we've had sort of 85, 90% support for the EU. Although there's going to be a reaction, I think ultimately this is going to be good for the Commission. In other words, there has been this feeling that EU money, nobody's responsible for it. And this is one of the most undemocratic, but also one of the elements of the EU that made people feel the most angry or distant or concerned about it, was this idea that it didn't, the money all got spent according to formula and not as if anybody was thinking about it or taking responsibility for it. And I think that the EU Commission saying, no, we won't hand a blank check to the Kaczynski, to Jarosław Kaczynski or Viktor Orban, is a really important step in giving people more across Europe, giving people more confidence in the Commission that it's paying attention, that it has real values and so on. So I think this is if they follow through with it, which of course we have no idea if they will, I still feel some doubt about that. But it could be a really important turning point in how the Commission perceives itself and also how others perceive it.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, go ahead, Timothy.
Just to pick up directly on that, I'm afraid, Anne, I share your skepticism about how long it's going to be sustained. But it is really interesting because I think for the first time, West European taxpayers, particularly North European taxpayers and voters, are waking up to this issue. I was talking to a Green member of the Bundestag the other day who said in her constituency in deepest West Germany, people were asking her, why is our money going to pay for these quote unquote dictators in Poland or Hungary? And that's really very important. But of course, the countervailing force is business, and particularly German business, which, as we all know, has had a very sweet deal in Hungary in particular, but also in Slovakia and elsewhere, and has been urging the German government and other European governments to take a soft line. So this very complex political institutional system of the EU has all these different countervailing forces. And I think it's a big question which ones are going to win out. I mean, the European Parliament, not accidentally, has been always a pretty positive force on this subject, but it's been constrained by the Commission and above all by the European Council, which consists of national leaders who are afraid themselves of getting criticized. Can I add one other a quick point on this, which is that actually we had a question here. Did you see the question in the chat?
Yes, I'll bring it in a moment. Go ahead with what you're going to say, and I'm going to ask that question. And
okay, I'll come back to the other point because it's connected.
Okay, so the question that we
Can I say
have,
something?
yeah, Charles, please go ahead.
Point. I'd like to point out the hypocrisy that exists in Hungary and in Poland as well when it comes to German business. On the one hand, they invite German business, and obviously this creates work for people, and that these two countries benefit greatly. On the other hand, they attack the very businesses because they take the money out of Poland or Hungary and profit from it. So the argument that then they make is totally ridiculous, which is that whatever financial benefits they get from Brussels is not really a gift. It's not really support. It's compensation for their allowing these businesses to operate in Hungary and Poland. And why the EU does not respond to this kind of nonsense is beyond me.
And in fact, Charles, what you just said relates very well to the question. I'm not sure if the live audience in Budapest can see it, but essentially the question is about the link between the economic model of the EU and the fact that its institutions and its legal norms are very much based on its economic model. You know, it was set up, as was said earlier, very much as an economic community. And it's only later that there was a retrofit, as Timothy Garton was saying, of democratic norms and indeed the whole rhetoric of values actually is relatively recent. It's in the last certainly 30 years and a lot of it within the last 20 years. So there is a problem that the EU sees, there's an increasing gap between the EU's self-perception and the rhetoric of leaders, and I'm talking about national leaders who speak at EU level as well, and the kinds of popular perceptions that Charles Gati was just talking about, how the people themselves see it, and indeed the previous comments about taxpayers waking up to the fact that it's their money being transferred. So the thing about the economics is that the erosion or paralysis of democracy, as it says in the question, and that maybe more freedom of economic models in member states might help to enable democratic practice. So is it about the constraints that the EU puts on economic policy, which are undoubtedly there, particularly in the past decade with austerity and the imposition of economic governance conditions, which include restrictions, and of course, famously with the criteria for joining the euro, and the Stability and Growth Pact, which is now being revived by Germany, despite a lot of economic policy orthodoxy having moved far away from austerity. But within the EU, there's still this pressure to have at least some constraints on government spending and a particular kind of economic model that fits within the single market. This is related to democracy in a number of different ways. It would be interesting to hear how you think this is related. I'll just give you two quick ideas to contend with. So one is that the EU has actually put up with much more diversity of democratic models than it has with economic models. There is diversity of economic models. I mean, Britain was a member of the EU for several decades with a really very different model from the social market economy of Germany, the Rhineland model, for example, and certainly from the Scandinavian models. So, but now the EU is kind of forcing more conformity in terms of economic models, but it's allowing a lot more diversity in terms of democratic models. Is this more of a problem, in fact? But also, is this sense of that was referred to earlier, that somehow politicians, I think this was Tim Snyder at the very beginning, people are not wrong to believe that their governments do not control events, and this frustration makes them really worried, and it's what leads to a great deal of the sense of two tribes and of populism and so on. How does this political economy work in terms of democracy? Anne?
So I think I was the one who said that thing about people feeling, that they have no influence over their leaders, or they're somehow disconnected from their leaders. And of course, this problem is 10 times worse at the EU level than it is at the national level. That Europe has often seemed to be locked into these, and this was true for the sake of people's convenience, and it was also true for the sake of making the thing work. But it felt like Europe was locked into this single model. There was always the same answer to the questions, whatever it was: budget, the amount of budget deficit you were allowed to have and so on. And that gave people little room to maneuver. And it created this idea that the EU is this sort of omnipotent negative force who are restraining our national leaders. And then, of course, a lot of national leaders used that in their rhetoric to, well, it wasn't me who failed, it was the EU. And there was a lot of, blame. I mean, that still goes on everywhere. Blame the EU for things that are really your own fault. But I think the more that the EU can become an institution that does react to voters, that does react to shifting times, the more the parliament becomes visible and influential, the more it looks like a real democratic body that's influenced both by states, by national leaders, but also by the European Parliament, but also by European voters, the more legitimacy it will have. I mean, it does always have it is at risk of a legitimacy crisis precisely because it seems to be so distant. It's several layers away from most people, several institutional layers, and again, it feels like it runs on autopilot. And this is why, as I said, first of all, the potentially the fund that's been created for the post-COVID world, and secondly, the actions towards Poland and Hungary, calling on them to live up to their ideals and so on. I mean, these are finally beginning to be steps that reflect the influence of real people. And I think if the EU doesn't head further and faster in that direction, we will be at the risk of breakup as people, more and more become frustrated with this feeling that it's people in Brussels who have no idea about what goes on here at home.
And I just follow straight up on that. Of course, I totally agree with what Anne said. But one way of thinking about what Viktor Orban and Jarosław Kaczynski are trying to do is to de-link EU membership from the regime type of liberal democracy. So this goes to your point, Heather. Less diversity of economic system, but allowing more diversity of political system. And arguably, it should precisely be the other way around. And what we should want the EU to do is to be allowing more diversity of economic model, very difficult inside the Eurozone in particular, but the great mistake in the first years of the Eurozone crisis, the German mistake, was not to allow for more difference of economic model in a country like Greece, because economies are also an aspect of national culture. They are very different, but not to allow for so much diversity of political model. Second point, since we're talking history, it's really important to remember that the divorce between the Europe of values and the Europe of money goes right back to the late 1940s. The EU is not the only institution in Europe, nor is NATO. The very first institution of European cooperation was the Council of Europe, which still exists with the Strasbourg Court, European Court of Human Rights. And of course, we have the OSCE. Our problem is that the values are very carefully and well monitored in those two institutions, OSCE, Council of Europe, which have all the values, but very little of the clout. And the EU has the clout, but too little of the values. So there's a fundamental problem in the whole way Europe has evolved historically since 1945 in the divorce between those two sorts of institutional Europe. Since I guess we have to wrap up, can I just make one last point? Because I think you're going to go to us for last words, which is, I really want to say this. Our mistake, and Anne touched on this briefly, in the 1990s and particularly early 2000s, was to believe in a linear extrapolation of history. That because things had gone so well in the run up to 89 and since 89, history was going to continue on that line. And that was, of course, a great mistake for which we paid a heavy price. However, now people are beginning to make the opposite mistake, and they're making a linear extrapolation from all the crises of liberal democracy, not just in Europe, but also in the United States and globally. But as a historian, one has to say, that's just as big a mistake as the last one. History is open. We do not make it just as we please, as the man said, but we do make it ourselves. And I can absolutely envisage a situation in 5 to 10 years' time when we're having this conversation again and we're looking at Poland and Hungary and we are saying that was a very, very bad period, but through a combination of domestic, above all, domestic and external, notably European, but also other factors, these countries have returned to something much closer to the path of our own very imperfect West European democracies.
Thank you very much. We're already into the coffee break and people are starting to join for the next panel. Hello, Catherine, nice to see you. So I just invite Charles to make his own final comments. Please take whatever you'd like from the discussion and then I'll come to you, Anne, for a final comment.
Thank you. Prior to this panel, you asked me if I would comment on what I saw ahead in 1989. And that's a very good question. So I will now make some confessions here, very candid confessions. I was full of hope and optimism. I did not foresee this much corruption throughout Central and Eastern Europe. I certainly did not expect that at least 2 presidents of the Czech Republic would be so close to the Russians, including the current one. I did not expect Orban, who was my friend, to turn out to be what he did. I went with him campaigning, just the 2 of us. I got to know him. And looking back, yes, I would have had some opportunities to see that he's a gambler, but I did not. I did see the nationalist alternative. By 1993, 94, I published a chapter in a book edited by Michael Mandelbaum. It came out in 95, but I wrote it a year before that, in which I did speak about a nationalist outburst. I did not, unfortunately, we all are guilty listening to city intellectuals in Budapest or in Warsaw or in Krakow, for that matter, or Prague, where I think all of us spent a lot of time over many years. And their odes to Europe, which of course go back to 1956 in Poland and in Hungary, I think confused us about the extent of support for a Western way of life. We did not go, or certainly I didn't go enough to the countryside. I don't know those people. I'm a slick city boy myself, and who grew up in Budapest. And I think we misjudged the situation and we confused realities with hope. We should not make that mistake again.
Thank you very much. Anne, thank you so much for having joined us incredibly early in the morning from Los Angeles. Your brain is functioning incredibly well on so little sleep. What would be your final comments?
So I think my final comment would be to re-emphasize something that I just said. I fully agree with Tim that history is not inevitable. We make choices every day that affect what happens tomorrow. This is one of the main themes of my book. And I would also re-encourage liberals in Hungary, in Poland, in Europe, to look carefully at other moments of great reform and change in their own countries. I recently spent a certain amount of time thinking about Theodore Roosevelt and the era of trust busting in the United States, which was another moment somehow papered over by Franklin Roosevelt a few years later. But it was a moment when the system seemed to be failing and resourceful people made it work again through creating new coalitions, through thinking differently about how to do politics. And I think we're at a moment now, actually in all of our democracies, where rethinking what a political coalition means, rethinking who your friends are, rethinking what your policies are, how do you address the real issues of the moment and not the ones that you remember? I mean, I think time, the things that used to divide the left and the right, which was an argument over the size of the state, these aren't the most important arguments anymore. And being ready to enter into new kinds of politics is something that all of us should be able to do. And I know that a lot of Hungarians have taken this on board already, and I hope the same will prove true in Poland. So thank you very much. I enjoyed being with you.
Thanks to you all for a really terrific debate. I hope it's been as interesting for those of you in Warsaw who've now missed your coffee break. Sorry about that. If you've stayed on to listen to us. But it's been really terrific. And I look forward to seeing all of you in Budapest in the near future.
Heather, thank you very much. Just stay with us for a second, because David Korányi, the head of City Diplomacy Department at the Budapest Municipality, wants to leave you with a short remark. So just for a second, and you should be seeing him, and probably now here as well.
Hi, Heather, can you hear me? Wonderful. Hi, Anne. Hi, Timothy. Hi, Charles. It's wonderful to see you, at least on the screen. I just wanted to say a quick hello from the venue in Budapest, the Central European University, and extend a heartfelt gratitude to this really, I would describe, intellectually orgasmic conversation that we have had the privilege to listen to in the last hour and a half or so. I really enjoyed it, and I have to admit, outside a movie theater, I rarely see a full group of people, full room of people so transfixed on a rather small screen in this case. So it was really, really fascinating. Thank you so much, and thanks, Anne, for waking up so early in LA. We really appreciate it. As you know, this was the inaugural forum, or is the inaugural forum, but we have already started conceptualizing next year's agenda, and I would love to have this exact same panel back in physical form, hopefully in Budapest, to kick off the conference as the first panel next year. That would be absolutely fantastic. And I'm really hoping, piggybacking on Timothy's and Charles's optimism, that it will take place in a vastly different political context in Hungary, in a re-democratizing Hungary under a Karácsony government. So thank you so much again for joining, and see you next year.
Bye, everybody.